Welcome to the Washington Connection with Candace Miller, your link to the U.S. Congress and how its actions affect you in the 10th District of Michigan, the Great Lakes State. From issues of national and worldwide significance to critical concerns in your hometown, Congresswoman Miller is in Washington working hard for you. And now, your Congresswoman, Candace Miller.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Candace Miller. I'm proud to be your representative from Michigan's great 10th Congressional District. You know, we're living through a remarkable and certainly a dramatic time in our nation's history. American values have been challenged, and actually for the first time in quite a long while, American lives have been threatened and actually taken on American soil. And amidst these times, it is crucial for us to remember that there are ordinary Americans who became extraordinary heroes. And those, of course, are war veterans. And today, I want to turn our thoughts to the nearly 19 million war veterans that we have living in our nation today. Our war veterans and the civilians who supported them all have stories of our nation's perseverance and commitment to democratic values. Their stories are about service and sacrifice, hardship and bravery. And their military or civilian experience really changed their lives and allowed freedom to flourish, not just in our nation, but around the world as well. However, these stories are also about hope, about opportunity, and they serve as a constant reminder to never lose hope, even when it seems like not a glimmer is left. And that is why, actually in the year of 2000, Congress passed legislation to create the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress through its American Folklife Center. The Veterans History Project is collecting interviews with veterans and those who serve to support them, and it's also seeking documents such as their letters and photographs for a national collection. The material will be preserved so that veterans and researchers and authors, filmmakers, teachers, students, just about anybody could experience certainly what our nation's veterans have experienced and how they changed our world. And I'm trying to do my part to support the Veterans History Project, and so today you will hear the stories of three veterans right here from the 10th District of Michigan. Jack Wolf is from Sanilac County. He served in World War II. Jack Little is from Lapeer County, and Jack is a veteran of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. And then finally, Macomb County's Digger Odell, who served in Vietnam as an Air Force fighter pilot and then spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. So listen to their stories and learn from them. They are all great Americans who have sacrificed so much for our nation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our very first guest today, Jack Wolf. So Jack Wolf, I certainly appreciate so much your willingness to join us today and to share your memories and your experiences about your history as a veteran. And you know, when we talk about history, all history has a beginning, so I got to ask you this question. How did you begin your military career? How old were you? You know, did you enlist, or the war had just begun, or how did it all begin for you?
I was 18 in July. War was declared in December, so I went right down and enlisted. And I wasn't the only one that done that. My generation of people were anxious to go. They couldn't wait to get down. In fact, it took 3 days for me to get into the line to talk to the recruiter.
You're kidding?
Yes, ma'am.
Wow.
So it was the start of my military career then.
Yeah. Well, that was so the war had begun, and everybody certainly had a sense of what was happening in the world and
they did.
How important it was for America to be fully engaged in that. Now, when you went down to enlist, was there any particular branch of the military that you wanted to get in and you ended up in another one, or did you get where you wanted to go?
Well, I got where I wanted to go. My father had been an infantryman in World War I. So we had discussed this when war was almost, we knew it was going to happen. And he said, well, don't go in the infantry. Go in the Air Force. So at 18, you could pick the branch of service you wanted to go in.
I see.
So when I went down, I told him the Air Force, and things started happening from then.
You thought it was better to be up in the air than down in the below, huh?
And I wasn't too sure about it, but he was adamant that I don't go in the infantry. He had got banged up pretty bad in World War I, so I took my father's advice, and I'm glad I did now.
Yeah. So how was it? Now you enlist, you're into the military. Now where did they send you? Did you have a particular place you had to go to? Well, I don't know if it was boot camp or
well, it was.
pilot's
My
training,
first, I enlisted in Detroit.
Okay.
and they sent me to Fort Custer. And I was there about 3 days getting uniform and supplies. And then they shipped me, of all places, for boot camp to Atlantic City, New Jersey, on the boardwalk.
Before the casinos, huh?
Before the casinos, yes. It was quite a place in those days.
Yeah.
The Miss America contest had been held there for years. It still is, I believe. Of course, I'd never seen it. They didn't have television that days, but I had seen it on in movie pictures. So that's the first place we went into to do what they usually do in the Army, to check you over first.
Sure.
And
You got to have your whole physical, right?
That's right. That was the biggest building I think I'd ever seen. I'd only been in 2 states, Michigan and Ohio, in those days. So right away, it was quite an interesting thing to see. And after boot camp, we took many tests, and my preference would have been a flight engineer, but they said, no, after these tests, you'd make a good radio operator. No one wanted to be a radio operator. So that's what it was, so I accepted it. And I went to Scott Field in Belleville, Illinois.
Oh, in Illinois, okay.
Yeah. It's still a field. I believe it's still
Yeah,
active.
I think you're right. Okay, sure.
And after radio school, I think it was around 6 months, night and day, they needed gunners and they needed radio men. I went to gunnery school in Las Vegas, Nevada, at McCarran Field, the same field now that the civilians fly into. And then after...
That's right, that is a civilian. Now, is that a joint use field? I'm trying to remember.
No, they have the Air Force has another field close by. I can't remember what it's called, but it's strictly a civilian field now.
Okay, sure.
But it's still there, and I go to Vegas quite often and
you think about that, huh?
I do. Where was the barracks? And of course, I took my first airplane ride there, and I thought, where did we take off from? And that was quite an experience too. But after gunnery school, then I went to Tucson, Arizona, to form our crew, and we formed our crew and stayed in Tucson about 2 months, and then we moved to El Paso, Texas, and practiced bombing runs and gunnery and so forth. Another couple of months, and then we ended up in Blythe, California, in the middle of the desert.
Wow, you really moved around
We did.
America before you went anywhere else.
Yes, ma'am, and it was hot, and the asphalt would blow off the runway when they'd run the engines up, so they moved us to a little town in northern California called Salinas, California, beautiful little town. And we flew around there for a while. We got a 7-day delay en route. We picked up our plane in Harrington, Kansas.
Wow, what kind of plane, if I could interrupt?
It was a B-24.
B-24?
Yeah, that's a heavy bomber. In those days, you had 2, the B-24 and the B-17.
Now, the B-24 was built at Willow Run, I believe,
Willow
right?
Run,
By
yes.
Rosie the Riveter.
Rosie the Riveter, right.
Yeah, right, okay.
Any number of them was built there.
Sure.
Of course, I don't know where the one we had was built.
Yeah.
I think we did find out, but didn't pay much attention to it.
Yeah.
And after that, we, the co-pilot lived in Salt Lake City, and we had picked up our plane in Harrington, Kansas, going to California. So we stopped in Salt Lake City and spent the night there. We got to Harrington, we got to Marshfield in California, and they gave us a 45, and we thought we was really going into combat.
Yeah.
We took off one night for Hickam Field in Honolulu, flew all night, and got there the next morning. They changed our plans to go farther south because they wanted to change the turret, and we only had a nose turret, didn't have a tail turret. So they put the turret in the tail because the Japs were attacking from the nose.
I see.
Finally, they got it done. We island hopped all the way down to Townsville, Australia. They decided we had to lay around there for a while because this is the way the Army operates. I think it still does today. They took it out of the tail and put it back in the nose.
Oh, geez.
And of course, we thought that that would be our plane in combat. And we flew into New Guinea, got assigned to our squadron. Never seen the airplane after that.
Oh, boy.
So after, in those days, we went home in combat hours. You had to fly 300 combat hours.
I see.
Which came out to, in my case, it was 55 missions because I flew a few extra missions because they were shorter radio men, but the rest of the crew didn't.
So you definitely did see combat.
Oh yes, a lot of combat.
Well,
yeah.
perhaps you could tell us some of your first experiences in combat. And
Well, the first experience is something I don't think anyone would forget, especially when the flak starts coming, the fighters start coming at you. But it's just something that you actually got used to it and expected it every day or every mission you went on. And there was casualties, of course, and there was problems, but you overcame these things. It was a war, and you made the best of it.
Now, where were you actually flying? This was down in the eastern area?
In New Guinea.
In New Guinea,
Yeah.
okay.
We left Australia and was assigned to a group, 43rd Bomb Group in New Guinea. There was 2 heavy groups there.
Yeah.
The 43rd Bomb Group and the 90th, which was called the Jolly Rogers. They had the Colonel Rogers was the commander, and he had the Jolly Rogers emblem on the tails of all their airplanes.
And what was your impression of our Air Force, I suppose, at that time, the kind of iron that you were flying with the B-24 as opposed to, and what were you actually fighting? Who? The Japanese, I suppose?
Japanese.
And what were they flying? How did that...
Well, our biggest menace at that time was the Japanese Zero. That was their fighter pilot, or fighter plane. And, of course, superiority was, I'd have to say, the Japanese had the superiority at this particular time.
At that time,
yeah,
they did,
they had a
yes.
lot of fighters. Our missions were mostly on harbors, and the flak was heavy from the ships, of course. And it worked out that we ended up the superior after a few months, if you read your history about that particular part of the war.
Were Japanese, you know, you often hear about the Japanese kamikaze pilots and that. Did you ever run into that kind of thing when you were fighting with the Japanese?
I shot down my first plane, and I swear that he was going to ram us.
Really?
He kept coming, I kept firing. And
now, I've lost track. Were you in the back or the front of the plane with the turret?
The radio man didn't fly in a turret. He had a flexible gun which stuck out. It was 50 caliber. You stuck it out the window.
I see. Okay.
Getting in and out of the turrets were too much time-consuming, so we decided that the radio man, because I had to go on the radio, also be a gunner. So I flew a flexible gun, and he kept coming and firing, and I kept firing, and I remember they taught us to fire short round, short bursts, so you wouldn't melt the barrel. But when you get a little bit excited, I kind of held the triggers down, and I seen the tracers going out like that. But the plane exploded. It seemed in 10 or 15 feet of us. It might have been farther than that. But it's cold. It's about probably 35 or 40 below zero, and you got an oxygen mask on, and then you're sweating, and it's it's coming out and freezing on the oxygen mask.
Yeah.
So it's a young person's war, believe me. It's,
yeah.
I don't think I could handle it today at my age, but I'd give it a go if I had to.
Yeah. And what were some of the other combat experiences? How many missions did you actually fly then?
I flew 55 there.
55?
Yes, ma'am.
Always in the same aircraft or the same type of aircraft? Or
well, the same
area?
B-24, yeah, that's all was in our squadron, but different aircraft. We weren't assigned an aircraft.
I see.
Because the scarcity of planes at that time, and they had to cannibalize one to make another one fly, so you didn't know what airplane you was going to get into.
And you were always flying out of New Guinea?
Out of New Guinea, different spots in New Guinea. First of all, Port Moresby, then we moved on up. Well, the Japanese had control of one in New Guinea, and the Americans had control of the other. And as the war progressed, we moved on up towards the Jap lines, which made our missions shorter, of course. And then not all missions were bombing New Guinea. There were surrounding islands, too, that the Japanese controlled.
Yeah.
And usually before invasions or something, they would pound it pretty good with the aircraft.
Did you feel as a young soldier there that you had some idea of the overall strategy of what you were doing? I mean, generally the strategy of why it was important to be in that particular locale, and as you're moving toward the Japanese nation and some of those things? How did you just every day, you lived it every day and just try to get through it? Or?
Well, I was quite young, of course, and my main thoughts at that time were when we were going to get our leave to Sydney, Australia. And after about halfway through our tour, we did get that. Ours happened to come on Christmas and New Year's of 1943, so we were in Sydney, Australia for 2 weeks during that time. But other than that, I didn't really give the war too much thought. I had a lot of confidence in our commanders and our generals and our politicians. I thought they were doing the best they could. Whatever
It's a terrible time.
It was a terrible time, it was, but they did very well. Everyone did very well. The main thing in flying on bombers is the crew. It's not so much the individual, it's the crew. And I was lucky to have a wonderful crew. I was the youngest guy on the crew, and the pilot was the second youngest. And he was a big, strappy young man from Illinois. And I had all the confidence in the world in this guy, as well as with our navigator and our bombardier.
So important, isn't it?
Very important. And the other gunners were we just gelled beautiful. Lived together, slept together, and just had a
true team.
A true team we were.
And everybody has to depend on one another. Each job is so important, and everybody is expecting the other.
That's the way it works in a bomber, and it was an exciting time for a young person. It really was.
Now, what was your final rank, Jack, when you left service? Tech Sergeant.
Yeah, that's... in those days, I think you had to be a staff sergeant according to the Geneva Conference. So if you got captured, you didn't have to work. I think that's what. So they made everyone at least a staff sergeant, and then the radio operator, chief radio operator, and the engineer were tech sergeants. Everyone else staff sergeant. Then the officers. We had 4 officers: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and navigator.
And could I ask you, were you ever awarded any medals or citations?
I was, yes, ma'am. I was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 5 Oak Leaf Custers, and of course battle stars in both theaters of war.
Well, it's been remarkable to be able to hear your story and hear your experiences, and I think we just have about a minute left, and during that time I'm going to ask you to show our viewers these pictures that you have, and tell us what we're looking at here, Jack. I know you brought some photos along.
Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am.
Please.
This is my crew in the Pacific on a B-24, and this.
How many crew are there?
There's 10.
10. Okay.
Yeah. And this is my crew in Europe on a B-26, which is a 2-engine bomber.
And that is a B-24.
That's a B-26.
Oh, 26.
That's 2-engine.
Okay.
This is 4-engine.
I see.
And this is a crew of 7. 4 officers and 3 gunners.
It's great that you have those memories.
I
guess the final thing I'd ask you, do you think it's a worthwhile endeavor for a young person today to join today's military?
I wouldn't hesitate a minute to tell every young person that is the way to go. It really is. The experience, the camaraderie, it's just a beautiful thing for a young person.
Absolutely. Well, we're proud of you, Jack Wolf. Thank you so much on behalf of a very grateful nation. We certainly appreciate you sharing your experiences with us today.
My pleasure, ma'am.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very kindly.
Thanks, Jack. I'd like to introduce our second guest now. This is a veteran, Jack Little from Lapeer County. Jack served in the Korean War as well as the Vietnam War. Jack Little from Lapeer County. I know that you served a very long and very distinguished military career. I think you were in the service for about 20 years or 21 years.
21 years, yes.
And so if you think about 21 years, I'd like to ask you as well, how did it ever begin, really? How old were you, and did you enlist? Were you drafted? Did you have a particular branch of the service that you obviously you got in and that's where you wanted to go, or how did it all begin for you?
Well, no, I wasn't drafted. It was in 1948 when I enlisted. I was 17 years old, and you needed parental permission at age 17, but I'd left home when I was 16 and quit school. And so my dad wasn't too happy when I did finally come back to see him and ask him to sign the papers, but he did. And I went through my basic training down in San Antonio, Texas, 13 weeks of boot camp. And as I think back through it again, I realized that it was good. It was different, very different.
At the time, you probably weren't so certain, huh?
The rigidity was good. I think young people need that, and it served me well. I left there and was stationed at Langley Field in Virginia, where ultimately ended up with the 4th Fighter Wing. And then I met up with them in Korea, but I left them.
What were they flying? What kind of planes were they flying?
I think they had the first F-86s at that time, the Saberjet. They were the aircraft that really made their name in the dogfights in Korea, the F-86s. But I went from Virginia, I was sent up on what they call TDY, temporary duty, and we opened Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. And I met a beautiful 16-year-old, and we swept each other off our feet, had a child. And within 2 weeks of that child being born and died, I was sent to Korea.
My goodness.
I ended up in Korea in August the 2nd of 1950. And for those who know any of the Korean history, the war started on June 25th. By August, the North Koreans had all but a small perimeter around Busan. And I think many people, with the exception of General MacArthur, thought we would be pushed off that peninsula. It was an unusual experience, of course, to go to a new kind of place, seeing just new lands in itself.
Yeah, certainly. The culture, the people,
The culture,
food,
the people, and you know,
everything, huh?
and when I heard your previous fellow talking, Jack, you know, there's so many of us that are involved in these things that don't fly the airplanes and don't fight on the front lines, but we're there doing the things that need to be done. I was with a technical support group at first. We pretty much lived with the Army doing the forward controller work, and I primarily took care of generating units that supplied the power so they could haul it out there and take care of it. But that was my entrance into a strange land and a strange knowing. And I think it was there in Korea where I began to realize the difference between supervisors and leaders.
Sure, that's a good way to put it.
I know that the one organization I was with, that we lived up in the hills, he would never eat. He was a captain. And he would never eat in the mess until we had all eaten.
Yeah. As you say, the difference between supervisors and leaders. Sometimes that leadership is a intangible quality.
Yes.
But you know it when you meet it.
And when you recognize it and see it, I think it's a goal to strive for any of us. Because his thought was he would not eat unless his men ate.
Yeah. We're talking about eating. What did you actually eat in Korea? And you know, one thing that I have heard so many Korean veterans say, that the Cold War was never as cold as Korea.
Korea was cold.
That it was so that is so much of their memories is how cold it was, and the kinds of foods that you were eating as well. As you say, a young guy, everything was foreign. Do you?
Well, powdered eggs are much different than what we're used to having. And powdered milk, and there was nothing fresh. It was purely a sea ration diet that we had for many months. There was a large epidemic of hepatitis that broke out in Korea, and I came down with it and was sent back to Japan for 2.5 months to a place called Kyoto. Those that went back, and it was all services that went to this hospital, as soon as you were cured, they sent you back to Korea again. So some of the guys weren't too anxious to take their medicine. You could understand.
Sure.
But, you know, when you mention it being cold, it certainly was. You know, living in those squat tents, if you were living in anything at all, and we were in squat tents. But nothing to what those poor guys experienced when they got up to the Yalu River. Because, you know, General MacArthur, who we thought was a great leader. And it wasn't until later I realized that when he was removed that certainly the civilians must run our army and our military. But it was a devastating blow to us there to have him taken away from us. Because he had told us in September of 1950 we would be at the Yalu River by Christmas, no, the Yalu River by Thanksgiving. And home for Christmas. Well, those poor guys that got up to the Yalu River by Thanksgiving were the ones that got hit by the hundreds of thousands of Chinese that came in 1950. And then the war just went on, you know, for about a year and a half after that until the peace treaty was signed. No peace treaty. There was no peace treaty.
Right.
The armistice was signed in July 27th, 1953. In fact, we just passed the 50th anniversary of that armistice, and we had a commemoration ceremony in Lapeer.
Right.
And that's why I got back to wearing the uniform for the commemoration ceremony, and I'm very proud to have served. And,
well, so many people have said that Korea, unfortunately, was the forgotten war. And, you know, we get an opportunity to talk to a veteran like you, and we remember that it's will always be a remembered victory, quite frankly. And as you were moving in Korea and moving towards some of the different locations, troops on the grounds and moving, did you have any experiences, Jack, with the people there? I've had so many Korean veterans that have talked about how the people touch them, and they have memories of the culture, the individual, maybe the child or something.
Yes, I lived in Asia 7 years, or served in Asia 7 years and lived there. In each of those occasions, I found myself attached to orphanages or children that needed somebody. In Korea, there was a young lad, and I have a picture I can show, named Jimmy, that I just kind of picked him up on the streets. He was trying to steal from me.
It couldn't have been his real name, right? Jimmy?
No, I don't even remember
the
his
name
real
that you gave him?
And I had him for over a year. Kept him, fed him out of my mess kit. First, they wouldn't let him go through the mess line with him. We'd take stuff back and feed him in the tent. And he stayed with us for some time. He stayed with me. He slept with me. He slept on the floor on my cot. When I left, I gave him to another guy.
A lot of orphans.
A lot of orphans, and you know, it's sad when you see. I think what we know as people who have been over in those places, we know what bad is.
You know what bad is, and you know what good can be as well, I suppose. And I think people that have had an opportunity to serve our nation obviously come back to America and think about how it is here, and the opportunities that we have, and what freedom means. And of course, the price of freedom is never free.
Well, and that's of course one of the symbols of the forgotten war veterans, and even those who are involved now. Freedom is not free. And I don't think so many just don't understand how very, very fortunate we are. And we are because of those who gave during the different wars that we had, those who will continue to raise their hand and go. I know in Korea, the war lasted 37 months. 37 months. 1 year, 1 month, no, 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days. And there were almost 37 killed or died in Korea. That's 1,000 a month. I wonder how the nation would be reacting now if we had those kind of casualties. And yet, if we hadn't have done that, all of Korea would be a concern for us right now.
You know, you're absolutely right. And I know we want to talk about your experiences, but I had an opportunity to see a photograph of the Korean Peninsula, and an aerial photograph from a satellite, which showed the North Korea almost completely black in the dark, and the southern part was awash with light. And if it hadn't been for America and what people like you did, Jack Little there, I think would be a much different aerial view that we've had. But let us move on to some of your other experiences as well. Korean War veteran, and I believe you served sometime in Vietnam also.
Yes, when I came back from Korea, I remarried and had 5 children, and then was sent to what they call JUSMAG, Joint Military Advisory Group, to the Philippines, and I was an advisor to the Philippine Military Air Force for 2 years. Came back to the United States, and 6 months later my organization out of California was alerted to go to Thailand, and although I was certainly not eligible to go, qualified because I'd only been back 6 months, I raised my hand, and I went to Ubon, Thailand, stayed there for a year, and then certainly was eligible to come home. And I raised my hand again. And, excuse me, and were sent to Da Nang.
And when was this, Jack? What years would this have been?
I was in Thailand in 65, 66, and in Da Nang, Vietnam in 66 and 67. And Da Nang was, I guess one of the things I began to realize, the Korean War was front lines, much what many people know to be war. There were the lines established, and then you had the back, and the air bases were basically safe places. Mm-hmm. The Vietnam War was not that way. There was no safe place. In one night alone, at our base in Da Nang, we lost 31 airplanes blown up.
Hmm. It was a different type of a war.
Yeah, and when you take that change from Korea to Vietnam, mm-hmm. to what we're doing now, mm-hmm. the war has changed again.
Mm-hmm. It has.
But it is still clearly a war that threatens our way of life. Mm-hmm. But it's more difficult to understand and more difficult to fight. Mm-hmm. And I think people have a hope on the other side of us that we'll just get weary of it, and then that'll be our downfall.
Jack, can you tell us about some of the different medals that you were awarded, or citations?
Well, yes, I have. I was given the Bronze Star for some things I did in Vietnam at Da Nang. And if you ever look at someone wearing these things, the highest ranking one is always up here. So the Bronze Star is there, and actually I probably shouldn't be wearing it, as you know. I gave that one away. But, and then I had the Air Force Commendation Ribbon, and those are two individual things that are given for individuals. The others are things giving more as unit citations. This is a presidential unit citation that are given to units that the president has recognized that has done certain things. Mm-hmm. There is one in there that's a Korean presidential unit citation. And then the majority of times, if you're in certain areas, you have battle ribbons or combat ribbons saying you were involved in certain things. Mm-hmm.
Well, Jack, we just have about a minute left. I know you brought a couple of photos. I don't believe that our viewers will be able to see this. We'll hopefully be able to superimpose this one, but you might tell us what that one is briefly.
That's Jimmy, the little guy, and myself.
What year would that have been again?
This was 1951.
1951.
And
do you have any idea what ever happened to Jimmy?
No, I do not. I came across a ticket counter guy one time at O'Hare Airport with the name Jimmy on it, and I was in a rush. I wish I would have stopped. He was Korean. Mm-hmm. And after you've been over there a while, you can kind of identify the Korean from the Chinese, mm-hmm. from the Japanese.
Sure. This
is what I looked like in 1950.
Well, you were a good-looking guy, and you still are, Jack.
Oh,
you're just
thanks.
a puppy.
That's when we used to call the old brown shoe days, when the Air Force was still in brown shoes and ODs.
Yeah.
And this happens to be a picture of myself and my dear wife taken in front of the Korean Memorial on a visit that I came up to see Congresswoman Miller.
Yes.
At her office.
Yes, and we talked about, I knew you were going to visit that memorial. That is one of the, well, the Vietnam Memorial is, they say, the most visited memorial in D.C., closely followed here by the Korean War Memorial. It is such a dramatic memorial. It's 19 American men, larger than life.
Larger than life.
All moving toward the American flag.
And if the reflection is right, the 19 reflect off the wall, and there are 38 for the 38th parallel.
Really? No, I did not know that. I did not know that. Well, it's a remarkable memorial, and certainly was pleased to have you come to Washington, D.C. and to visit me and have an opportunity to talk to you today as well about your experiences. And Jack, on behalf of a very grateful nation and world, I would say as well, we certainly salute you and thank you so much for joining us with your experiences.
My pleasure, Congresswoman.
Jack Little, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to introduce to you our third and final guest. This is Donald, commonly known as Digger O'Dell. He's from Macomb County. He served in Vietnam for a number of years, spent 5.5 years as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. Digger, welcome to our program. I certainly appreciate you taking a few moments to join with us today. And I have to call you Digger. I know your real name is Donald, but I've known you for many years, and everybody calls you Digger O'Dell.
If my wife calls me Donald, I know I'm in trouble.
Well, let's start from the beginning. You had just a remarkable career in the military, many years in service, and perhaps you could tell our listening audience here a bit about how old you were when you first decided to enlist, or were drafted, or what were the circumstances, and how did you decide to go into the Air Force?
Well, I graduated from high school in July. I enlisted in September 1952, a couple months later. I was running with a group of individuals that were sort of headed for disaster, if you know what I mean, as a young kid.
Yeah.
And this gentleman I chummed around with considerably. And I had a brother who was a paratrooper. Well, obviously, I want to be a paratrooper, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, I was 18, but he was only 17. So his folks finally agreed they would not sign for him to be a paratrooper, but they would sign if we went in the Air Force. So that's how I ended up choosing the Air Force.
Really?
And enlisted in September and went through basic boot camp down at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Finished that and went on to electronics school in Denver, and then to an assignment in Arizona as a radar repair technician on the flight line for the fighter aircraft.
Mm-hmm. What kind of planes were you even working on at that time?
At that time I was working on F-86Ds, F-94Cs, and 89Ds. Never at that moment ever thinking that I eventually would fly the F-86D, which in a couple years later I did.
Yeah, and how did that actually begin? I mean, you obviously had to go to pilot training and
yeah, that was
very stringent requirements to get into that.
And not having 2 years college, which was a prerequisite. Well, anyways, I was sort of given the Technician of the Month award, and I got to know this lieutenant there was flying 94Cs, and he said, you know, would you like to go for an airplane ride? And I go, yes, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I went for the ride, got back on the ground, and there's no doubt in my mind what I wanted to be.
Wanted to be
Until
a pilot,
that moment, I really didn't know who I wanted to be or what I wanted to be.
Yeah.
But I knew then that I wanted to be a pilot. And started the long drill to get into pilot training without the 2 years of college. And finally persuaded him into allowing me to go take the Stay Nines for pilot training if I could pass a 2-year level college entrance exam.
I see.
Which my cohorts there, we worked day and night, and I got to the point I was saturated and went and took it, passed it, and then of course went on to take the pilot training tests.
And where was that at, your pilot training?
I took the tests up in San Francisco. Then I went to pre-flight at Lackland Air Force Base. It's more like OCS, Officer Candidate School.
I see.
And then I took my primary flying training at Kinston Air Force Base, or Air Base. Back then it wasn't Air Force.
Yeah, moved around
Kinston,
there.
North Carolina, and then to Vance Air Force Base for advanced. And my primary instructor became very disgruntled with me because I was like number 2 in the class, and you of course got to pick your assignment, which was fighters. Okay. Well, and they said, well, we need somebody, a few, to volunteer to go to multi-engine school. And my ambition at that time was not to make the Air Force a career. My ambition was to be an airline pilot. That's we make a lot more money being an airline pilot.
Right.
So I volunteered, and I thought he was going to shoot me. He was just so upset with me because yeah, he was just one of those individuals who believed you had to fly as a single person, not with a crew.
Yeah.
That's how he had grown up.
Right, right.
So I
now-
finally convinced him that that was the way.
Right. So now you're a pilot. What was your first plane that you were really able to fly?
Yeah, I went to multi-engine school in the B-25, and then like a year and a half later, and I stayed there as an instructor pilot. If you graduated in the top 10%, you were offered given the opportunity to stay as an instructor pilot, Air Force Pilot Training School. So I did a year and a half instructing in the B-25s, year and a half in the T-33s. They went to all jet training. And it really benefited me because, the best way to learn something is try to teach it.
Yeah,
And,
sure.
I enjoyed it, but after a while it did get a little repetitious. And then from there I went to fighters, F-86s, down to Perrin, and then from there on over to Germany and did a little over 3 years in a fighter squadron flying F-86s over there. Well, I should say about a year and a half, and we deactivated, and I went and flew the F-102 Delta Wing in the western part of Germany at Bitburg.
I see.
And then came back to Selfridge.
Yeah, that's right. Selfridge Air National Guard Base.
Well, no, back then it was Air Force Base.
Right, that's
yes.
right. Yes, that's exactly
From
right.
there I went to Vietnam.
And what year was that when you went to Vietnam?
August of 1967.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your experiences there and what happened to you there.
Well, I had a short career as a fighter-bomber pilot, we called ourselves, because we were bombing rail lines and targets up in North Vietnam. And I was shot down on my 17th mission. Actually, in my bio, I don't use the number 17, but I was shot down on the 17th of October, 17 miles northeast of Hanoi on the 17th of October.
Really?
If I ever go to Vegas, I don't plan on
Using the number
I
17.
won't bet on 17. It was
Right.
my father's birthday, too.
Really? Now, what type of plane was that you were shot
I was
down?
flying a F-105, Thunder Chief, commonly called the Thud,
I see.
because we lost so many there, and they hit the ground, they go Thud.
Yeah.
So that's how it got a nickname.
The name Thud, huh? So you were shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese.
Stood no chance of being rescued. I was in between the northeast, northwest rail lines coming out of China, and we knew that if you went down, in that area, there would be no attempt to get you, because crossing those rail lines was a tremendous responsibility to the people trying to get to you, because they had just so many anti-aircraft guns there that it was almost impossible to get across there. Whereas I'd helped rescue a guy 5 miles south of Hanoi, the capital. We went in and got him, but not if
But where you went, they would not come in.
No.
Did you have trouble ejecting from the aircraft, or did you have injuries when you landed, or?
Well, what happened is I took we call it the golden BB, like the first round out of this anti-aircraft guns, and the odds of hitting you were, most of the time they just laid layers of shrapnel. You had to go down through it, and you had to come up through it. So, eventually, if you throw enough steel up there, it's going to hit somebody. But apparently, I took a direct hit right in the belly of the airplane, and that airplane was originally designed to carry a nuclear weapon in there, a nuclear-type missile. So we had an extra fuel tank in there, and that, of course, blew up. And the aircraft, of course, was on fire. I could see it in the rearview mirrors, and I was trying to control it, thinking, if I could make the coastline to
have a chance.
safe haven, I'd stand a chance of being rescued. But then it eventually broke in half behind the cockpit and started tumbling. I had great difficulty ejecting out of it because of the negative G-force. And when I ejected, I figured that I would probably at least break my legs when that seat come up and fired, because I wasn't really down in the seat. And when the seat fired, and I went out, I guess when the chute popped open, I sort of looked at myself and felt my legs, and I didn't sustain any injury from it. But then the next revelation came, and no matter where I looked, it was North Vietnam. And like most of us are all normal, it always happens to the other guy, not me.
Right.
And I was the other guy that day.
And so the North Vietnamese, did they capture you immediately? Were you in the brush there for some period of time, or
Yeah.
what?
Once the chute stabilized, because I got out pretty low altitude, trying to get the airplane to fly, and then I went into the tumble with it, and I was going to land like in a small hamlet, maybe encompassing probably 100 to 200 people or less. And I was going to land right in the hamlet, so I climbed up the harness, cut some of the shroud lines on the parachute with my knife, and so I could guide it, and landed just outside in a rice paddy. But when I looked down, they were all running around down there like, they're waiting to catch me.
Yeah.
And when I slid down the edge of the rice paddy and undid my harness, pulled my radio out, transmitted the line that I was on the ground and about to be captured, I had no injuries. Of course, that transmission never was received.
Really?
They don't know why, because we had emergency radios. You were issued one, and you could have as many as you wanted. I had 3. One is good, 2 is better, and 3 was a lot better.
Right.
But,
And yet they never received the transmission?
No, I never received the transmissions. So I was initially turned in as killed in action.
I see. So you were captured. Did they immediately take you to what became very infamously known as the Hanoi Hilton? I know you spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, I spent almost 5.5 years between that and other prisons within the POW prisoner of war system there. But the local populace was the only people, that had control of me initially, and it would be like our civil defense people, only they were armed with very antiquish weapons, but I wasn't about to challenge those weapons. And they held me till evening, then a big, like a Chinese, the 6-ply truck came and picked me up and took me to Hanoi. And they were starting to treat me rather brutally, and I was praying that the military would get me, because I was beginning to fear for my life with the people.
With the civilians.
Yeah. And so when the military got me and got to Hanoi, I thought, oh, this is going to be better, but it turned out it wasn't.
So you spent all that time there, and there were a number of individuals that served with you there as well, over 100 men, I think.
Yep. Well, we had at one time 352.
Really?
Yeah, in different camps. They're basically in close proximity of Hanoi, although there was Sante, which is out to the west, where they attempted to rescue those guys there. And the one I went to up on the China border, which we call Dog Patch.
Dog Patch. Where there were times, I'm certain, where you thought you'd never be back to Michigan, huh?
Yeah, you every now and then you wanted to give up, but that's what your fellow man is for with you. You know, he's going to pull you back up out of there, and you know, maybe a month later you're going to do the same for him. You know, and you realize how important those people are to you. You know, as an individual that we sort of take for granted in our everyday walk of life.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to happen to you. And we didn't know if we're going to be there 5 years, 10, 15, or 20. We had no idea.
How was it when you were finally released? You knew you were going to be released, and when was that?
I was released on 14 March 1973. They told us in January, after I came back from the camp on the China border, back to a camp there right inside the city limits of Hanoi. And they were required by the different peace committees from North Vietnam and the United States and France that they had to play this tape recorder to us and take a picture to verify that that we knew we were going to get released. That was the first inkling that we had.
We were going to.
We sort of had a feeling, because when we went to the mountains in trucks, you know, they covered us with machine guns. We got one bowl of rice and maybe one little vial of water in those 2.5 days. But coming back down, you know, they were those that could speak English. Some of the interrogators were, you know, you got to forget whatever happened to you here. You don't need to tell anybody. So that was the first inkling, you know, that we had, that something big.
Sure.
And they weren't covering us with the machine guns or anything. So they were trying to change that brutality environment.
Right.
You know, right from that point.
Right. Well, we just have a minute left. I would like to be able to continue to talk to you about all your experiences. It's just a remarkable career, but with everything that's happened to you, what would you tell a young person today, a young man or woman thinking about going into the military or trying to protect America?
I've done a lot of speaking to schools since I've been home. I guess the best way to express that would be, if I had my life to live over again, I would definitely be an Air Force fighter pilot. Loved
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
Loved it. Yep. Yeah.
Well, you really exemplify what America is all about, what our values are all about, and what freedom means to every single one of us. So,
thank you.
Colonel Digger Odell, on behalf of a very grateful nation, we certainly appreciate you so much joining with us today and talking about your experiences.
Enjoyed being here.
Thank you. Welcome home.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Clearly, Americans have an awful lot to learn from our nation's veterans. Their stories lend us a greater understanding of how the bravery of our nation's men and women in uniform have protected the freedom of our country, and how actions today will affect us as a whole in the future. I'm proud to support the Veterans History Project, and I'm certainly encouraging you to take part yourself. Our generation, every generation, has so much to learn from those who have served our nation. And now the Veterans History Project is also seeking your participation. To learn more how you can participate, and you can also receive a project kit, you can write my office. Our address is 48653 Van Dyke Avenue, We're located in Shelby Township. The zip code there is 48317. Or you could go to the project's website. The website address is www.loc.gov/vets. And you'll find out how to be a part of this national initiative to save our nation's memory. Certainly we can all benefit from learning from the past and imagining a better future. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Candace Miller, again proud to be your member of Congress for Michigan's 10th Congressional District.
This has been The Washington Connection with Candace Miller. Look for new episodes each month as Congresswoman Candace Miller continues working for you and keeping you informed about important issues facing the 10th District and our nation.